terribly cheap cassette tape recorders, terribly cheap cassettes, and we really didn't. We just didn't pay enough attention to end quality. We were able eventually to hear all these tapes, but they were not broadcast quality. There was a time when we wanted to get some of this stuff broadcast, and whenever you took it to the BBC, they said, "Oh, lovely stuff, but we can't produce any of it because of the broadcast quality." And there were also lots of mythologies going around then. We had no pounds. I mean, people used to say that if you took a cassette tape, magnetic tape on the underground, it would wipe it clean. We used to travel across bits of London on buses rather than risk having a tape. It's like people feel about going through the, passport control. You're going through the magnetic, screener to check whether you've got any metal on. You think, oh, your camera film, your digital chip is going to get wiped and everything. Anyway, we were very naive, but we did this work. And one of the first, in honour partly of Stubbs Turtle, we did the first books we did was called Working Lives Volume 1. There were 2 volumes of Working Lives. And what we were trying to do was to collect the reminiscences of a very wide range of people who'd lived for a long time in Hackney, who'd done what were then considered fairly typical Hackney, were involved in typical Hackney trades, whether it was furniture making, dressmaking, nursing, market gardening, that was another one, and of course docking, because a lot of Hackney people still work in the docks. And I'm just going to read a couple of extracts from these, because I do think they give a flavour of just the sort of work that was involved. And the first person I interviewed for this book was a man called Alf Deadman, who then was the lockkeeper at on the River Lee, just below Victoria Park. I can't. I'll tell you because it's in here. Yeah.
Bromley on Bay?
It was just up above from Bromley Bay, the next one up. No, it doesn't say, but this was him. And we kind of romanticised the work of dockers and lightermen, but it was tremendously hard. And I'll just read some of a couple of little extracts from this recording. I can't find a tape for this one, I'm afraid. But he grew up in Custom House in Canning Town. Though he later lived in Hackney and worked in Hackney. And he's talking about school at the age of 14. In my last 3 months at school, we did nothing, precisely nothing. One afternoon our teacher said to us, "Well, for the sake of something to do, I'll go around the class and ask you all what you're going to do when you leave school." The school was in Canning Town, where I was born and brought up. Barring one boy who said he was going to be a bank clerk, I don't know if he ever made it, we all said either docker, stevedore or lighterman. I was the only lighterman in the class. The teacher braced himself and said, "Well, that's all you're bloody fit for." Any romantic notion that schooling in the old days was much better than it is now is complete nonsense. All the people who talked at school mostly found it boring, and they felt condemned by either where they lived or their parents' occupation or the poverty of where they were, that somehow life was always going to be a struggle. There weren't the opportunities there. I think why this importance to detail of work is so crucial is that we've forgotten just how hard physical work was. And I did another book for the Lighterman later on, Bob Harris, and both kind of said much the same story, that a lighter, which is a barge, of up to 90 tonnes, would be expected to be, up to 60 tonnes, would expect to be rowed single-handedly by one person, one man. 60 tonnes on the River Thames. Going with the tide, you went with the tide, so it might be 3 o'clock in the morning, it probably would be pitch black, if you like, or it might be in the day. And you also had to negotiate the speed of the tides and getting through the arches between the bridges. And mostly the work involves going from the docks of London, just downriver from the Tower Bridge, up to somewhere like Battersea or Chelsea. And that rowing was done with a single oar, a bit like gondoliers from the back, 90 tons under your own power, in possibly the pouring rain, in the dark, with the tide, having to cope with the tide and so on. Tremendous, tremendous skill. And as he says, when I started work, all the craft were rowed. There was tug power, but it was in its infancy. Tug power in those days was such that tugs could not pull barges over the tide. They weren't strong enough, that's against the tide. Whereas today they'll pull 6 barges over the tide as easily as if they were going with the tide. They've got so much power. Rowing was done until you reached high water. Then you stopped and waited until the next flood. What was more, to row a barge you had to deal with not just the tide, but the wind and the sets of the tide as well. The set of the tide is the speed of the flow on a particular part of the river at a particular place. You would have 2 men rowing a barge with a capacity of about 150 tons. Over 60 tons you could not row on your own. And on your own, even rowing a little punt of 60 tons at night or on a busy day on the river could be a very hazardous affair. But you were never on your own for the first 2 years. You were always in the company of a licensed lighter. Given that he started at 16, by 18 this young man was rowing single-handedly a 60-ton barge up and down the Thames. And it remained then a casual occupation. In those days of casual labour, you got a job like this. There was a place called Poverty Corner, a stretch of pavement outside Mark Lane Kew, now Tower Hill Station, about 100 yards down Tower Hill. There were other places like it, but this was the main one. All the out-of-work lightsmen used to go up there and stand on Poverty Corner. The various firms used to come out, take a list of names, and then go back into their office. You would wait, and they would come out, perhaps 10 minutes later, perhaps half an hour, perhaps an hour, and pick out about 5 or 6 out of 100 men. Of course, if there was a staggering amount of work, they might take the whole lot. You took your chance, just like the doctor. But he used to have to take his chance in the mornings, but the lightsmen took their chance at night. And lastly, the skill of this, he talks about collecting 40 barges from a lock by 20 different firms in the dark, and they did everything by whistling. All the instructions to each other, the location of which firm had to pick up which barge was all done by a system of whistling. You would get about 40 barges in a lock from about 20 firms probably. There would be 20 tugs outside, and each firm had its own recognition call in the pitch black darkness. All different types of whistle. The skipper of a tug would shout out as best as he could, "Generals, folks!" Generals was the name of one of the companies, and the lighterman would whistle or sometimes shout to direct the tugs to the right barges in the dark. There would be a shuffle all over the place, tugs and barges vying with each other, but it would all end up very orderly with barges behind tugs. Or take what happened when you had a big Cunarder, say, chugging out of Surrey commercial docks at half flood with sailing barges, men rowing barges about 20 tons, and maybe a collier coming down from Battersea on the river. You would have looked and thought, well, something's going to happen, make an awful bang around here somewhere. But it never did happen. There would be a hasty blowing, and around you would go. Tugs and barges would all turn round and let this Cunarder swim. They all used to sort themselves out, even though the skippers in those days did not have the power to make way against the tide. To turn themselves and get out of the way against the tide was really skillful. So it was that kind of working experience that we became very interested in the detail, whether it was in the rag trade or the furniture trade. Unbelievable amounts of skill. I occasionally get that feeling, I don't know if it still is, but there used to be a shop in Tottenham Court Road that sold woodworking chisels. And you'll buy a box of these woodworking chisels from £650.